Success. I did it. Thank you. Thank you. I feel so tech savvy now. So it's apparently it's doing what it's supposed to do, and only the 12th week of the semester too. So let me put in my files here and open up whatever it is that we need to open up. Here, go to US foreign policy and go to lesson plan. So, so we have a debate on Friday. And, so make sure that you know that, but let me also open up. Site campus site. And, sorry for my foul. Advertisements. Buy something. I know I don't want to buy. I want to teach my class. Campus. I just did log in. Here. Okay, so here, and I think this is Migu. Is that it? No, it's not. Here. Okay, here we go. And, yeah, I think that's it, right? Yeah. So, U.S. foreign policy and smart attendance. Chul Suk. That's attendance, right? Chul Suk. Okay, I'm gonna go here. Week 12 and smart to Chusok, smart attendance, and your number is 878. 878 is your smart attendance number. So we go back here and I go to 878. Oh no, chat is, which one is chat here? This one? Chatting 878. So I think that's right there. Yeah, okay. 878. All right, there you go. See, everything is moving nicely. And you can, somebody can turn off this light maybe so that it's easier for you to see. If it's easier for you to see it rather than have so much light that blind there. Okay, so 878 is your smart attendance number, and back to the class. So I'm really kind of nervous and excited because after this class, I'm going to New Orleans, USA for a conference. And it's the first time I've moved out of Seoul since February 2 years ago, 2020. And and that's, of course, a big focus of the conference I'm going to is the Eastern Europe and Russia. It's the Association for Slavic East European Eurasian Studies Conference that is coming up. And so I had to get vaccinated, of course, and I had to get a PCR test done 2 days ago down at the Sosa Health Center, which worked out okay. And I got the PCR test results yesterday morning. I'm negative, no COVID-19. So I'm ready to go. And okay, so we're talking about one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter is the debate topic. So, okay, that's what I'm saying. When we meet, of course, on Friday, our Friday class is always online, but I'm going to be teaching from the hotel room where I'll be staying. So I'll be at the conference hotel. So it should be a nice connection, internet connection, because it's a major hotel. And I will be teaching, I'll start 7 o'clock in the evening, my time, which will be Thursday, 9 o'clock. Well, I teach the other class I'll be teaching from my hotel room when we meet online on Friday. And okay, so it doesn't make any difference to anything, but I'm just going to tell you that it's kind of fun that I'll be at this conference, and if there's something interesting about U.S. foreign policy that comes up at the conference, which I'm sure there will be something interesting, I will let you know. I'm going to present a paper on Bulgaria and Macedonia, and Bulgarian nationalism and Macedonian nationalism is the paper that I sent out a couple of days ago. I told you I have to write papers like I ask you to write papers. I have to write papers too, and they have to be eventually good enough that they can get published by somebody. So this is all part of that process, and I'll be presenting on Bulgaria at that conference. Okay, so and what is this? This is all U.S. foreign policy, and so what do we want to get organized with today? So we go towards the bottom here, and all right, so we're talking about, let's open up the notes to make sure that we cover the notes. National security and defense policy, and in a sense, we're going back to what we started off this semester with in terms of the Cold War. It's an ongoing issue, and I think it is so important because in a self-serving way, it seems to me, and I'm in a minority on this, right, that the U.S. did not win the Cold War. The Soviet Union was not trying to conquer the world. The Soviet Union was not a Russian version of Hitler's Germany, but that is the dominant view, the politically dominant view in Washington today, including among most smart people, most intellectuals, that the United States saved you, and me from totalitarianism, that the Soviet Union wanted to conquer you and make us all slaves of communism, and the United States, through NATO, through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, through the IMF, through America's informal networks of business and politics and connection, through its allies like Pak Chung-hee, Syngman Rhee, the initial founders of modern Korea, that South Korea, that not only did we save South Korea, but we saved all of the whole world. And thank you, South Korea, for being a close ally of the United States in battling communism. Now, we still have some problems left over. We still have garbage left in the form of what George W. Bush called the axis of evil, in the form of Saddam Hussein of Iraq, but he's gone, in the form of Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia, but he's gone, in terms of the Islamic regime in Iran that, according to people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor of Jimmy Carter, the Soviet Union, Moscow had something to do with overthrowing America's CIA agent, the Shah of Iran, that the CIA put in power with British MI5 in 1953. The Soviet Union did something there. But in this self-serving worldview, this is garbage left over from the Cold War. And now America should clean up this garbage. Because if you don't, the Soviet Union was like a big cancer tumor. You know, tumor, cancer? It was a big tumor in the international community, this evil cancer. And the Americans, despite setbacks like in Vietnam, it still succeeded in containing and destroying this cancer tumor through containing it. Remember, the Soviet Union had to expand to survive. And if it could not expand, it would die. And it died because America, despite setbacks in Vietnam, still, thanks to Ronald Reagan, not thanks to Jimmy Carter, but thanks to strong conservatives like Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon earlier, America demonstrated the will and determination to bring about such containment and conflict among the communist actors themselves that America stressed those communist relationships between Beijing and Moscow and made them stronger and stronger. And this, again, still is due to America's will and determination to exercise containment, still fractured the communist bloc and caused the Soviet Union to disintegrate. Now, we got overly excited about our win, and we decided we didn't want to focus enough on international relations after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what was the consequence? These people argue the consequence was the spread of political Islam. Political Islam was allowed to continue to spread, but the Americans, of course, they played some role in supporting the Islamists. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, America supported Islamists because they were killing Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan when the Soviet Union invaded in December 1979. But the Americans decided wrongly that they should not focus so much on international affairs. And as a result, they had the consequence of the attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001, because of those actors having their own dreams and desires, and including threatening America's allies and friends that played such an important role in containment in the Middle East, like the House of Saud, the Saudi royal family, and Israel. And so America must, in this worldview, show the will and determination to kill these cancer cells that, when you get a tumor, if you don't kill the tumor early enough, little cancer cells metastasize, move the tumor around to other organs. And so that has happened as a result of the Cold War. The Americans destroyed the main tumor, but the garbage left over still is there and is still an infection, a sickness, spreading criminality and militancy, terrorists around the world. And so that is why I think understanding the Cold War is such an important topic, not just because it's a history lesson, but because it justifies to the Americans, to themselves, why they continue to spend almost $800 billion a year on military, more than the 10 other countries combined, more than China, Russia, Western European countries. You bring them all together, and the Americans still spend more money on military than they do. Is there a problem? Isn't that an indicator that something is wrong? 30 years after the Soviet Union disappeared? Americans say, no. Those military instruments and those institutions that support them, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they brought peace to the world. They saved the world from the Russian version of Nazi Germany. So just the fact that the Americans spend lots of money on defense doesn't mean that there's a problem. Now, if you're China or you're Iran or some other actors, you say, you're right, Ben, it's a problem. But the American prevailing view is that, no, it's not a problem. And so this belief that America won the Cold War and saved the world from the Russian version of Nazi Germany is being used as a source of lessons or insight as to what to do about China. That, well, we contained the Soviet Union and saved democracy and freedom for the world against the Soviet Union. We've got a problem with China. China is bad. China is a one-party state, calls itself the Chinese Communist Party. And we should contain China because containment is good, because it saved the world against Moscow. Now we'll save the world against Beijing. And again, the same arguments are made that Beijing must expand its power and influence over other countries if the Chinese Communist Party's dictatorship can be justified and maintained. And there are millions of people in the Communist Party of China whose identities and careers are built around that Chinese Communist Party. And they lead a totalitarian state that tries to control what people read and see on the internet through the Great Firewall, and to justify that totalitarian control, including over family planning. How many babies are you allowed to have? You should have fewer babies. No, we changed our mind. Now you should have more babies. That's the kind of government that rules in China. It actually tries to determine how many children you're allowed to have. And then it changes its mind and says, now you should have more. And to justify that kind of totalitarian control over the people of China needs a justification. Why? When China is becoming more prosperous? Because the Chinese communists, like the Americans, like the Belgians, like the French, like the Swiss, like the Koreans, they tend to see the world in a way that's self-serving. And so, because the world is still threatening to China, because the United States wants to destroy us, because they want to divide China. They want to. First off, they do not want us to reunify with Taiwan, when the Americans are the reason why Taiwan split. The Americans sent their Navy in 1950 to protect Taiwan. That's the only reason why Mao Zedong didn't invade Taiwan. The American 5th Pacific Fleet. And, you know, the Chinese know this. I listen to American news media reports. I never come across that point. That from a Chinese point of view, the only reason why there is a separate Taiwan is because the Americans sent their Navy to protect Chiang Kai-shek, Kuomintang regime when it fled the mainland in defeat to the island of Taiwan. That the Americans and the rest of the world want to split Tibet, take away Chinese territory, and not just the Americans, it's the Russians and the British. I mean, China used to be so big. Mongolia used to be part of China until the Russians inspired an uprising in Mongolia and made big part of Mongolia leave China. That was Chinese territory. Everything east of the Lake Baikal in Siberia, that used to be part of China too, and we lost that. The British and the French took away what they used to call French Indochina. So from the perspective of Korean nationalists, that area that is now Vietnam and elsewhere was part of the Chinese Empire as well. All taken away by the French, the Russians, white racist imperialists. And then, of course, let's not forget the Japanese, what the Japanese did in learning from the British and the Americans about how to be racist imperialists. So they come up with their own self-justification as to why we should not have democracy, bourgeois democracy in China, because it's still, the world is still a scary, dangerous place for China, and only the Chinese Communist Party can continue the process of developing and strengthening China against these terrible threats. And, you know, I'm 40 years older than you, so I remember when relations between China and the United States improved after the U.S. defeat in Vietnam. Richard Nixon improved relations with China to pressure Moscow and Hanoi to help America leave Vietnam without looking like it was defeated. And then Jimmy Carter encouraged even closer relations with China in the late 1970s. China under Deng Xiaoping went to war with Vietnam after Vietnam defeated the Americans. Ooh, we lost the war. Oh, China is attacking Vietnam. Go China! Yeah, you teach those Vietnamese, China. And China shifted to become basically a de facto ally of the United States in containment against the Soviet Union, with this upsurge of American nationalism that began under Richard Nixon, right? That we will rebuild our influence in the world. Moscow is still the bad guy. China, we will use China. And I remember when I went to college in 1980 at Ohio State, that there was these Chinese students started coming into American colleges and universities by the thousands. and they were studying engineering and math, but they're also studying political science. And they were learning American political science theory. And America dominates international relations political science theory, including the theory of neorealism, right? Neorealism emphasizes the lessons learned, supposedly learned from the Cold War, that great powers are inevitably in intense conflict, that the world is an anarchic, dangerous place, that when one great power emerges, other actors will try to replace it, and there will likely be an intense conflict, even a war, between a current hegemon and a new rising hegemon, whether it be Britain against Germany or the Soviet Union against the United States. Now, of course, the United States is like Britain in the late 19th century, and China is something like Germany at the same time 120 years ago. That there's a rising China, and inevitably there will be a conflict, an intense conflict between China and the United States. And you find neorealist thinkers like John Mearsheimer, most famous realist thinker today. I think I showed you a picture of him. He wrote with Stephen Walt, that book, The Israel Lobby. John Mearsheimer talks about the tragedy of international relations. He argues it's inevitable that there will be intense conflict between US and China. It doesn't matter what kind of political systems they have. It doesn't matter. It's just because realists have a negative view of human nature. People like to control and dominate each other just for the sake of dominating and controlling each other. And they lie. They lie to each other, and they lie to themselves as to what their motivations are. Like Hans Morgenthau pointed out, strongly influenced by Sigmund Freud's notions of subconscious. We lie to ourselves and to each other all the time. And it doesn't really matter. It could be, China could be a monarchy, or it could be some kind of democratic political system. I mean, Germany under Bismarck, they had elections. That was a democracy under Otto von Bismarck after Germany unified. The German parliament had elections for the German parliament, and it had to approve the budget of the government. And they still went to war with Britain, another democracy. Surrealists argue the kind of political system doesn't matter. Conflict is inevitable. Okay, Chinese today say you're right. Conflict is inevitable. The Americans will resist us, and they will do whatever it takes to maintain their primacy. So again, we cannot liberalize, we cannot democratize in China, because the Americans, with their spies and agents in Hong Kong and in Tibet, and working through their encouragement of Islamic terrorism in Afghanistan and elsewhere, they want to destroy China because China is rising. It's just inevitable. That's what neorealists plan. Yes. Yeah, okay, but it's kind of self-serving. Like, for example, the people that talk about the democratic peace theory, they can't agree about whether or not Bismarck's Germany 140 years ago, was that a democracy? It looked like a democracy to me. They had elections. Now, I know the Kaiser, the king, he could remove prime ministers, but so could the German parliament. And I told you, the German parliament had to approve, the democratically elected German parliament had to approve budgets, including the military budget. So it's like this democratic peace theory is, it almost seems like a self-serving justification for why America should involve itself in wars to make democracies. Because if America invades Afghanistan and invades Iraq and puts democracies there, they spread peace. I mean, there were, I think, 3 elections in Afghanistan in the last 20 years that the Americans tried to help organize. 3. Regime gone. Vietnam, they organized elections in South Vietnam too. Didn't work. And so those democratic peace theorists, and they say, well, no. What we meant is mature democracies don't go to war with each other. Mature democracies. What's a mature democracy? It's a democracy that acts in the way I think a good country should act. That's what they say. They say mature. What is a mature democracy? And then this mature democracy created Donald Trump, who won the election
in 2016 and tried to carry out a coup in January of this year. That's a mature democracy too. So, you know, I got a lot of problems with political science as a field. I got a lot of problems with political science, particularly American political science, because it's, again, so much influenced, I think, by the Cold War and the belief that America won. It defeated an expansionist Soviet Union that was imperialistic. And, yeah, this democratic peace theory, it's a problematic notion. And so national security emerged as that's a term that's only a 20th century term, and particularly became important in the later part of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. So national security, everything is justified and defended and explained in terms of national security. Who could be against national security, right? You can't be against national security. And so national security is used as a term for a president whose power and capabilities became incredibly powerful during the Cold War. It was under Richard Nixon that this term imperial presidency was used to describe the power of a US president to go to war and claim it was necessary for national security, and he's commander-in-chief of the US military, so he can, like Donald Trump, kill Soleiman Soleimani, the second most powerful figure in Iran in January early this year. Bomb Libya, like Barack Obama did in 2011, without getting the US Congress to declare war on Libya, and destroyed Libya. And of course, you Belgians and Swiss are the ones dealing with the consequences, as Libya is a main source of illegal immigration by the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands from Libya on boats to try to get to Italy and Malta and France and Greece, thanks to Barack Obama's decision that he needed to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, who was the long-term dictator in Libya, who was identified as one of these rogue actors who supported terrorism. And when they had the opportunity to get rid of him, they did, including having America's allies. I don't think the Belgian military bombed Libya, but the Americans, I think I recall, they actually got the Danish Air Force, along with the French Air Force and the British Air Force, to help bomb Libya in 2011, to help destroy the Libyan military and allow the Libyan rebels to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. Can you imagine Denmark actually killed people as part of NATO, as a NATO ally? Germany won't do it. I'm 59 years old. The Germans will not kill people. Americans asked them, would you please intervene in Libya? They said no. And I think it's again the legacy of World War II. The Germans, they just won't kill people since World War II anymore. But they got the Danes to do it, which is his son, Muammar Gaddafi's son, is running for president of Libya, and he's probably going to become president. It was in the news recently. So the term national security has entered into such broad usage since World War II that we cannot dispense with it. It always returns. And of course, these are my comments here. Again, this legacy that the United States faces this militant evil empire. That's how Ronald Reagan described the Soviet Union in a critical speech in 1983. The Soviet Union is the empire of evil. It may not be responsible for everything bad in the world, but he said, you can find this speech on YouTube, it's responsible for most of the bad things in the world, the evil empire. And so when you're confronting an evil empire, you face an emergency, and we must do what is necessary to defend national security. And Since then, since the Cold War, during the Cold War, millions of human beings in the United States, involving thousands of billions of dollars, have invested themselves in creating these Cold War containment instruments, military, bureaucratic, economic containment instruments that see the world in a self-serving way. Of course, big military is good. I love containment. That's why I got this job here. That's why you're here. That's why you were here, because of the Cold War and America's containment of communism. I think American influence isn't that bad. Gives me a job. Yeah, this guy's name, Barry Buzan, his name comes up all the time at these conferences. He, along with John Mersheimer, he might even be more influential than John Mersheimer, particularly among people that are more liberal in their orientation, that are more liberal or constructivist in their theoretical orientation for explaining international relations. This guy Buzan. So you might hear more about him if you do more reading in international relations theory. He's Canadian, which is interesting. He's not an American. He's a Canadian scholar, right? He talks about different elements of security: military security, economic security. Remember, the textbook was written before the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of these textbooks have to be greatly revised in terms of dealing with international relations, international economics, and international politics in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Political security, societal security, again, focusing less on this military component of national security. Because remember, the evil empire is stereotyped. Remember the evil enemy, diabolical enemy stereotype that I could show you from the PowerPoint presentation I showed you before? The evil empire doesn't care about civil society. It doesn't care about human rights. It doesn't care about human life. You think Stalin cares how many people will die if he can conquer Europe and get away with it? I mean, as I told you, I mean, when I was your age in the mid-1980s, when I started graduate school, there were people arguing, Colin Gray, famous British political scientist, arguing that Soviet Union, if they could fight World War III with nuclear weapons and lose no more than 50 million dead, but win and dominate the world, they would do it. 50, I don't know why, he said 50 million. They lost 27 million in World War II, I guess, so double that. You know, if they double that, 27 million, but win World War III and rule the world, they'll do it because they're communists. They don't give a crap about life. They're like Mordor in Lord of the Rings. What is a life? What's life into an orc empire? What's life to Sauron? Right? So, and so you can see there's been some effort since the Cold War to develop these notions of security in a more pluralistic, developed, complicated, complex way. Remember, what's the alternative to stereotyping? Seeing complexity in how Beijing makes foreign policy, seeing political complexity in the politics of Moscow, seeing political complexity in the policymaking process of Pyongyang, of Hanoi. And so this is a more complex picture of security, but you know, this is always a problem I face and we all face, that we have to talk to each other. I have to talk to other political scientists in ways they understand. So I have to use this kind of terminology, because if I use something that is totally outside the mainstream, people are going to say, you're a fringe, marginal person. Why should we talk to you? Nobody can understand what you're talking about. So you still have to use these terms in national security, because so many other people use those terms if you want to try to have an influence in this world. But the US Defense Department has become the main instrument for American, not just military, for American foreign policy. Again, How many bases does America have around the world? It's not really clear. I was listening last week. Somebody claimed America has 750 military bases around the planet. 750. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. Like you have a little base with like 10 American soldiers there. That's a base. I don't know. 750. And in addition to 400 in the US itself. So that's 1,150. So the U.S. Defense Department has assumed the greatest role in American foreign policy. It's got a massive budget, worldwide troop presence, and again, its military budget is not decreasing. The U.S. Congress under Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer of the Senate and Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader of the House, added another $25 billion to the Defense Department budget beyond what the Biden administration asked for. What's going on here? Okay, in the war on terrorists, further militarize U.S. foreign policy, kill them. Terrorists are like orcs. Terrorists are not humans. Kill them. Kill them. Assassinate drones. Because these people they're not humans. They're fanatics. They think they'll die and go to heaven with 77 virgins. I mean, that's the way these people talk. Look, the Quran says that if you die in jihad, you go to heaven and you'll be served by 77 virgins. Totally disrespectful to the religion of Islam. Increasingly, the Pentagon is involved even in providing U.S. economic development aid. Again, U.S. foreign policy is unique compared to Belgian or Korean or Swiss policy due to the extent that U.S. foreign policy is being crafted and implemented by the military. Again, because the military defeated the evil empire. That coldly rational, highly conspiratorial, cynical actor that only understands this. It only respects this, not democracy and human rights. This. The global representation of the U.S. is typically the military, even that you talk about we talk about a war on drugs. We talk about nation building in post-conflict environments, democracy promotion, development. All of these have securitized military security elements to them. But still, the U.S. maintains a wide lead over other great powers in terms of hard and soft power. What this soft power is, I don't really know. I mean, it seems to me the U.S. has soft power in Europe because the Europeans sort of accepted that notion that they faced a danger from communism. So America was an ally of German self-determination. It was an ally of Italian self-determination, not among all Italians, but among many Italians who saw the communists as a threat. It was an ally against, in favor of Belgian self-determination. But where it's seen as an enemy of self-determination, like in Afghanistan, the minute you take out that military, poof, the American client regime just collapses quicker than the regimes collapsed in communist Eastern Europe in 1989. Because that client regime was put in power with American bombs. Russia has more nuclear weapons. China has more soldiers, but that's not. The U.S. is the U.S. divides the entire world into separate regional commands. There's a North America command, a South America command, a Middle East command, an Asian command. The United States has divided the entire world into regional command centers for the U.S. military, and the U.S. dominates the world commons. That means everybody uses the sea to trade. And the sea routes are dominated by the U.S. Navy. The airspace, and this is now coming under challenge. And keep that in mind, right? That now that we have nuclear weapons, intentionally using all of your military capability is suicide because of nuclear weapons. So increasingly, we're seeing more of a focus on indirect competition between China and the United States and Russia, even when they do engage in aggressive damage creation against their cyber network, their internet. They do it in a way to hide or claim that they're not involved, they're not directly involved in it, because it makes it easier to control a conflict rather than allow it to escalate out of control. So you've seen this is a critical factor explaining how the world from 1945 is radically different since 1945 compared to the world before 1945. Because in 1945, the US used atomic bombs. And so competition between great powers is increasingly indirect because of the suicidal danger of the nuclear setting. And so you see the most bizarre, strange behaviors in compared to traditional classical histories of conflict between Britain and Germany, or France and Germany, and so on. For example, this, I don't think you remember this. This is how you fight wars in the nuclear era. You know what these are? These are metal rods with nails sticking out of them. So this was in 2020, 2 years ago. There was a border conflict. There is an ongoing border conflict between China and India. And China, under the Communist Party of China, views India as this thing that British white imperialist racism created, right? And when China was weak, the British Empire took much territory, significant territory, including Hong Kong, but also territory along the borders of what was then the British Empire, which is today India. So there's lots of border disputes. China claims that much of the territory along the border with India belongs to China. And there's tension. So between the border armies of India and China. And in June of 2020, this conflict escalated into a brawl in which at least 20 Indian soldiers died high up in the mountains, in the Himalayan mountains, where there's glaciers and big cliffs. A big mass of Indian soldiers and Chinese soldiers, after many years of tension, they fought a war in 1964, 2 years after I was born in that area. And they went after each other with these kinds of middle-age type weapons from 1,000 years ago, maces, clubs. And we don't know how many Chinese died. I think the CIA estimates that maybe 12 soldiers, maybe more Chinese soldiers died. And the Indians admitted that 20 Indian soldiers died. They fell off a cliff, died. But they fought their battle with these kinds of weapons. Not with guns, not with M16s or Kalashnikovs, with these. Why? Why would they fight? Remember, they had to make these weapons. They had to make these. Why did they make these weapons and fight with these? Like something out of the Middle Ages, out of Game of Thrones. Why? Because of nuclear weapons. They're terrified that if they fight and kill each other and they use guns, somebody pulls out a gun, boom, you pull out a gun on your side. Boom, we pull out 2 guns. Boom, you pull out 3 guns. Boom, they can escalate to full-scale gun battles, machine guns, artillery, mortars, artillery. Somebody calls in an airstrike. We're being mortared. Sending the planes to bomb the artillery that's bombing us. And it escalates to a battle that could escalate to war. So they purposefully use these non-gunpowder medieval weapons because they want to make a point, but they want to control the danger of escalation in the nuclear setting. So here you see the impact of nuclear weapons, in some sense, making people go backward. in terms of their use of military technology in order to try to exercise maximum control over the escalation dynamics. Because, you know, people become emotional when you start killing them, right? I mean, so that's just bizarre, isn't it? To control escalation. So conflict between great powers is increasingly indirect. It's done in medieval ways like this. Russia encourages, Putin encourages Lukashenko and Minsk to cause trouble with Poland, and Putin could say, I got nothing to do with this. That's between you, Brussels, and Lukashenko and the Minsk government in Belarus. We didn't intervene in U.S. election in 2016 through the Internet Research Agency to spread disinformation to help Donald Trump get. No, we didn't do it. We didn't do it. No. So, yeah. Maces and clubs and well, I mean, I don't know if any of you've done your military service, right? The Korean boys here, there's only one. Did you do your military service yet? Did you do military service? Did you learn how to use a bayonet? No, you didn't. I mean, we still have knives. But you know, that knife is on the end of the rifle. This, put your guns away. Everybody puts their pistols and rifles away, and they pick up one of these. So today. Put your pistols and rifles away. Yeah, but they didn't even use bayonets. I thank you for that question, because now that you ask, I was reminded of myself, why didn't they use knives? I mean, they all carry knives because it's too traditional. A knife is a bayonet that you put on the end of a rifle. So it's too easy to go from a bayonet to your rifle because it's maybe you put on the end of a rifle. So no knives. Medieval maces. And leave your rifles and pistols at home. And then, you know, so the Chinese and the Indian governments are still talking about this, blah, 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 blah. But in the meantime, of course, the Chinese economy is 5 times the size of the Indian economy. And the Indians know that, and the Chinese know that. Narendra Modi knows that, and Xi Jinping knows that. And Narendra Modi needs allies. He needs allies against China. And those allies, well, they try to appeal to shared ideology, right? Help us, Japan. Help us, Australia. Help us, United States. Help us as part of the democracies of Eastern Europe. Please help us. Perceived transnational appeal of ideology. Democracies against the bad Communist Party of China. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's all sorts of bargaining leverage going both ways. China still needs to export its goods to develop. I mean, to continue to develop. Still, China's a poor country. I mean, Xi Jinping is discussing or mentioning how China needs to rely more on its own internal market. But still, per capita, per person income in China is 1/6 of what it is in the US. US relies primarily on its own domestic consumption to power its economy, and China would like to do that too, but China still needs to export. But if China has horrible relations with US and Europe and India and Japan, it's going to be difficult for China to continue to export its, particularly its high value added products. I mean, China's trying to develop, again, I'm an old man. I remember when Boeing was the airline that dominated the world international travel plane market, right? So you flew here to Korea, and when I was a young boy, it was only Boeing. And then the Europeans decided, you know what? We need to have Airbus, because when you have a developed aerospace industry, you have lots of good paying jobs, you're high tech, you're modern, you have power, and you have prosperity. So now we have Boeing and Airbus. And the Americans tolerated that because Europe was allied with the United States during the Cold War. So they were unhappy that the European governments were actually subsidizing Airbus because they could not compete with Boeing without US government support. And the Europeans would point out that during the Cold War, Boeing had tremendous amounts of support from the US Defense Department to supply the US military. So Boeing was, in fact, subsidized by the US government during the Cold War, that it had all these huge military contracts to supply the US Air Force and Navy and Army, and then it used those skills to make its civilian jetliners. And so that was what the Europeans responded, and the Americans complained, and they still complain, but they didn't put sanctions on, well, they started under Trump to put sanctions on Airbus. But of course, the Chinese are saying they want to do the same thing. They want to develop their own aerospace industry, develop their own aerospace civilian production capabilities. And the Americans say, no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't subsidize your new industries. No. So China is different from the Soviet Union, because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and America did very little business. I mean, America, I think, bought less than $10 billion a year. They had less than $10 billion a year in trade with the Soviet Union. I think that's the number that comes to my mind. It was mostly agricultural goods. It was under Nixon that the US began selling corn and wheat to Russia, to the Soviet Union, so the Russians would have more food, meat production for their people. But that was about it. The Americans they bought some valuable product like titanium. The Soviet Union was a source for titanium that you use in planes. But it was less than $10 billion a year in trade. But to this day, Europe engages in almost half $1 trillion in trade with Europe. You know, Europe gets most of its oil and gas from Russia, right? US does much more business with China, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade every year with China. So America is also vulnerable, and China is also economically vulnerable. So the kind of competition, as people look for historical comparisons, the term is analogies, historical analogies, to explain how this so-called maybe new Cold War between US and China. I just heard it again this morning on National Public Radio. Will there be a new Cold War between the United States and China? A new Cold War? What does that mean? Well, that's what we're trying to talk about here, right? And what we've been talking about all semester. But with differences, because China is much more important and integrated into the world economy and capitalist production chains than the Soviet Union ever was. And so perceived transnational appeal of ideology. And this has always been a factor for China. Even when China was more poor, everybody knows that China is an emerging superpower. I was listening this morning to one professor, it's just one professor. So by 2030, in 9 years, the Chinese economy will be clearly bigger than the American economy. It might be bigger even now, but by 2030, there won't be any doubt about it. So in 9 years, China will be clearly the biggest economy in the world. And it's a nation state. It's 94% one ethnic group. The Soviet Union was only 50% Russian. And so nation states, they engage in that stereotyping predisposition we talked about in this class more so than non-nation states. So again, this is, well, just to show you these levers. And India is not a nation state. India is a multi-ethnic state. It's a legacy, a post-colonial, multi-ethnic state, like most of the states left from the British and French and Spanish and Portuguese empires and Dutch empires and Belgian empire. Don't forget the Belgian empire. I mean, India is more like Congo than it is like China. And that's a problem in terms of power capability. So, yeah, let me go back to the notes. Yeah, so, in the United States is engaged in 1.7 military actions per year. According to one estimate I recall from several months ago, on average, the U.S. dropped 72 bombs a day. This is before it left Afghanistan. 72 bombs a day the U.S. drops somewhere around the world in total. 72. How many bombs does China drop? Right? From the Chinese perspective, we haven't been in a war with anybody since Vietnam over 40 years ago, 50 years ago, well, 40 years ago. We're the danger, we're the threat to world peace. In Iraq, Jordan, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, America's using drones. But again, you say, well, that's really bad. That's really bad. Well, no. Neo-realists point out the world's a nasty place, and America is functioning as the de facto world policeman. And sometimes, if you're on the police force, you got to use deadly force against the criminals, the terrorists. And if yeah, the world's a nasty, bad place, but it was a lot nastier in the 1930s when there was no clear overarching power in Europe and the world. And again, America won the Cold War. Again, this is all just personal impressions I have, but I'm getting a sense that the Americans are just trying to forget about Afghanistan. Like, I mean, it's really significant what happened in Afghanistan. The Americans are there for 20 years. They decide to leave, and it goes poof. Huh? Well, I asked with the history class that I teach online on Wednesday, and I think we were talking, and I think that the difference is that during the Vietnam War, the Americans believed that they were in some global struggle against world communism. And communism is evil and democracy is good. And America leads the democratic capitalist world, and it was defeated in Vietnam. Oh my God. How could the communists beat us in Vietnam? Oh my God, the Soviet Union, they're going to use that win to spread even more communism. Oh my God. But Afghanistan, who speaks for political Islam? There is no great power that claims to be the capital of political Islam. Iran, but that's a Shia country, and Shia and Sunni Muslims, they don't like each other. And Iran's whole economy is about the size of half the US Defense Department budget. Their entire gross national product is half, 50% of $800 billion a year. You can't view that as some kind of superpower. And it's Shia, where 17% of Muslims in the world are Shia, and Shia and Sunni don't get along anywhere. Even in Bulgaria, they didn't get along when I was there. So the Americans can just say, well, it doesn't really, everybody's got a problem with political Islam. China's got tens of millions of Muslims in Xinjiang, Uyghurs. Russia has tens of millions of Muslims within the country. India's got 170 million Muslims. Everybody's got a problem with the Muslims, political Islam. not just America. So the defeat in Afghanistan, you know, it's embarrassing, but it's not that big a deal, particularly since Afghanistan is a lot closer to India and China and Russia than it is to America. And that's what the Chinese continue to complain about, that we're already seeing reports about Uyghurs going to Afghanistan, fleeing China. And so that is an issue, but you know, how big of a challenge is political Islam? Is political Islam going to erase borders between Xinjiang and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and erase all of those borders to create an Islamic caliphate from Morocco, Andalusia, all the way to Mindanao and Philippines, like Osama bin Laden used to say he wanted to see, an Islamic caliphate to unify all Muslims, to liberate them from their oppression by New Delhi, by Beijing, by Moscow, by Tel Aviv, by all of these actors that are oppressing and abusing by Myanmar, the Muslims around the world. Is that really going to happen? You know, it's hard for me to believe that even Islamic movements can they might, you know, get the Americans to, but even the Taliban is under threat from the pan-Islamists, the Islamic State that wants to continue to fight and sweep away all of these artificial borders that Lenin and Stalin created to create Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Sweep away these borders that the French and the British created between Iraq and Jordan and Syria and Libya and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. These were all created by the British and the French. We shouldn't overestimate the impact of political Islam. Political Islam is the most powerful grassroots social movement in the Middle East, but we shouldn't overestimate its capabilities as well, I think. So, you know, the U.S. is responding to challenges. You have also Russia and China wanted to be considered equal with the United States in dignity and respect and influence in world affairs. So clearly those, you Europeans, you Belgians and French, you might think the European Union is all about peace and promoting peace in Europe, but evidently Moscow does not view the European Union as an autonomous, independent force for peace in the world. I mean, they moved to annex Crimea and encourage the revolt in Donetsk region in Ukraine after Ukraine signed a free trade agreement with Ukraine, with the European Union. So you might say, apparently Moscow, the prevailing view, the dominant view in Moscow is the European Union is one side of a coin. On one side is NATO, the other side is European Union. NATO, European Union. For good or bad, that's the prevailing view in Moscow. Can Berlin and Brussels and Paris act and adopt policies to change that prevailing view in Moscow? That's an important question. But as I tell my European Union policymaking class, the Germans are terrified. They continually refuse to appear to be distancing the European Union own military and security capabilities from NATO, because they think that Poland and Czech Republic and these other states only cooperate with Germany so closely under American hegemony. Right? That the Poles tolerate the European Union, like the European Union, because they're American military soldiers and bases in Germany and in Poland now. So even though Emmanuel Macron is calling for, and he's not the first president, Mitterrand did 20 years ago, we need to develop an autonomous European military security capability to be a partner with the United States. The French periodically do that, make those calls, and the Germans say, no. European integration won't work without NATO, American hegemony. And that's what neorealists say. Yeah, you're right. NATO makes the security dilemma go away, so the Germans and French and Belgians don't have to worry about each other killing them because the Americans are the benign hegemon standing above them. Belgian, you be nice to him. You German, be nice to that French person, because I am the benign hegemon. And so now that security dilemma is overcome, you can cooperate, you can trade. You don't have to like French, you don't have to like Germans, but you can do business with them because you don't have to worry about them tomorrow stabbing you in the back because the Americans are there. You had a question?
Oh, no, I was just going to say.
Well, I mean, that was a big topic. I mean, I spent 15 years in Bulgaria, and everybody's using Zoom internet now. And so Georgi Perinsky was the Bulgarian former Communist Party, Socialist Party foreign minister for the Bulgarian Socialist Party. And he gave a talk to the European Union class at the University of Illinois from Brussels. And he had been a member of the European Parliament. And his English is better than mine. He was born and raised in the US and then gave up his US citizenship to pursue a political career in Bulgaria. He said when he was in the European Parliament people were complaining about how the Americans were pushing the European Union too hard to bring in these former communist countries into the European Union. That they were not ready, but the Americans said, no, you have to bring in Bulgaria and Romania and all of these countries now, do it. And they said, okay, we'll do it. So even the Americans view the European Union as part of their strategy, their grand strategy as described in the book, right? Even the Americans view the European expansion enlargement as part of American grand strategy. So, I don't like that term, but that's the one term everybody's using, so I got to use it too. Grand strategy. It's a statement of the essential objectives of a nation world politics and the means by which it will achieve those objectives. But it can be more or less conscious or not. I mean, the Americans never proclaim that they're trying to establish an American empire. They talk about New World Order under George H.W. Bush 30 years ago, or they talk about a rules-based international order under Joe Biden when, the Chinese would point out they haven't invaded anybody in 40 years. They haven't dropped bombs on anybody since 1979. There it was the Americans that attacked Serbia over Kosovo back in 1999 when you were born, when the United Nations Security Council refused to approve America attacking Belgrade, Serbia over Kosovo. It was the United States that invaded Iraq in 2003 without getting a United Nations Security Council resolution approving that invasion. But the Americans talk about a rules-based international order. No, but the Chinese don't say, they just keep their mouth shut. But they're thinking this. They do say these things at some time. When the Iranian government leaders go to Beijing, they talk just like the Iranian government leaders, the Chinese authorities, but they don't, they just keep quiet. And then, so the And so there might be, again, this notion of grand strategy emerges possibly and also in order to facilitate critique. Like it, rather than continue to just allow the conditions in place to continue to move forward with all their bureaucratic inertia and momentum, maybe we should be conscious and explicit about what we're trying to achieve. Aside from the words we use, what do we see the general thrust of American foreign policy in terms of the collection of actions over months, years, decades? The same true with Russia or China. And that's an effort to try to develop this notion of grand strategy so that we can try, I think, partly to get control over these vast vested interests that emerged since 1945 and that take on a life of their own and promote their own interests, including portraying the world in a way that continues to justify why they are big and powerful as organized, vast, bureaucratic vested interests, and why they should stay big and powerful, and why they should get even more big and powerful. Because that's what organizations do. They try to protect themselves, they try to expand where they can, and get more resources. Not because people are evil, it's human nature. So the elements of strategic thought. Among the external sources of strategy, the international political context creates the strategic environment in which a state, including the US, strategy must be applied. What is this political environment? Is it anarchy? Neo-realists say that's all you need to know. There's no world government. And so states face the security dilemma and in a self-help system that since there's no world government, it's just anarchy, anarchy. You have to prepare for the worst. So you build up a military because, you know, your neighbor might be nice today, but tomorrow there could be a coup and a bad guy replace him and he's going to attack you with his military, even though he says his military is just for defense. You've got to be prepared for that because we're in an anarchical system in which nobody's going to protect you but you ultimately. So you got to prepare for the worst, just in case. And as you prepare for the worst, you illustrate the security dilemma. You scare him because you're building up a military. You say, that's just for defense. So, well, you could be replaced by a jerk tomorrow. So you have to prepare for the worst. That's what neo-realists argue. And as I said, neo-realists and neo-realism are the dominant political science, international relations theory in the United States. So it consists of trends and relative power capabilities, as well as the perceived challenges from other states and other politically mobilized private groups. Now, you know, that's an interesting statement because it sounds like to me, he's saying that this is based upon your impression or your understanding or misunderstanding of what are the ultimate motivations for a country's behavior. That is what this is. How do you understand why Beijing is building all of those bases in the South China Sea? Why is Russia dismembering Crimea? Is it because it sees US as distracted by its wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? So, now China will move. Or is China belligerent because it thinks the Americans are a danger, an increasing danger to them, controlling the Pacific? I mean, you look at the Pacific Ocean, it's an American lake. When you consider Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, it's reigned in control by the American Navy as a consequence of the end of World War II. And if you're China, are you supposed to just accept that? When John Mersheimer tells you sooner or later, or Graham Allison tells you, another political scientist, sooner or later, there will be an intense conflict between China because there's always a conflict between the established hegemon and a rising hegemon. There always is a war. Always is either a cold or a hot war. Always. When all those Chinese political scientists, students went and studied international relations at Ohio State and University of Illinois and University of Pittsburgh and learned these neo-realist theories. So, yeah, so global objectives, and that relates to available resources and perceived threats. So that notion of perceived threats, again, he's mentioning threats. One of my issues that I think in political science and international relations theory is developed is how do you deal with an actor that's belligerent because it sees not threats, but marvelous opportunities? And again, the best example of a belligerent, vicious, great power that was belligerent and vicious, not because it was scared, but because it thought, oh my God, I'm surrounded by a bunch of wimps, a bunch of sissies, was Nazi Germany. That was the last example of a great power that was intentionally motivated by perceived opportunity, not perceived threat, perceived opportunity. That if they show the will and determination, they will conquer Europe. And you know, perceiving degenerate image, stereotype, is associates with perceiving opportunity. But again, the dominant view in the US is that no, the Soviet Union was a Russian version of Nazi Germany, but the Soviet Union didn't act like Nazi Germany. There's case after case of negative evidence where if you would have expected the Soviet Union to respond if it really was a Russian version of Nazi Germany, and it didn't respond. Like when the United States put a CIA agent in control on a big country on its border, Iran, in 1953. And what did the Soviet Union do? Nothing. Now, of course, Stalin died in the midst of Operation Ajax. He died in the midst of this going on. What about all this other negative evidence? Did you know, Europeans, that the Soviet Union occupied Austria at the end of World War II and kept it until the 1950s? You know, there's no Russian military bases in Austria. There haven't been Russian military bases in Austria since the 1950s. Would a Russian version of Nazi Germany just leave a country that it conquered? They left Austria. During the Vietnam War, the United States bombed Haiphong Harbor that supplied Hanoi, killing Russian sailors that were supplying North Vietnam. What did the Soviet Union do when the Americans killed their soldiers, their sailors? Didn't do anything. That's not a Russian version of Nazi Germany. You know what Hitler did when they dared defy him in Belgrade or elsewhere? So US primacy continues to be a defining feature of the strategic environment. Its economy has been weak with multiple economic military commitments. Other states have generally remained on the US bandwagon. As I said, even Germany, they might know that, America's too supportive of Israel. They might know that America is a problem, but the Germans will not challenge United States predominance in Western Europe, because I think it's because they don't think the Poles and the Czechs and the other peoples of Europe will tolerate it. The European Union has really not responded by building up its own military capabilities in response to the US. They have not really formed rival alliances. You see Russia and China forming alliances more and more closely. But again, Russia's economy, the whole economy is the size of South Korea's economy or Italy's economy. Even the most brash actions of the White House have not threatened most foreign governments, and they continue to cooperate with the United States. I was listening to Jan Egeland be interviewed of the Norwegian Refugee Council. I think he was a former Norwegian prime minister, talking about Afghanistan as becoming the world's greatest humanitarian catastrophe. There's 40 million people there. Those people, they're going into winter. There's going to be mass starvation. So there's going to be another big migration push of these people to leave Afghanistan to get to Belgium and France and Germany. Is this going to push the Europeans to demand the Americans remove their economic sanctions on Afghanistan, on the Taliban? Even as we're going to risk another big flood of refugees trying to get into Europe from this country that's they're calling it the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in the world, Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Americans have economic sanctions on the Taliban. They won't let the Taliban access their foreign currency reserves in American banks. So they can't do business. It's not easy to do business or trade with Afghanistan to get their economy moving again. Is the European Union going to stand up to the Americans? I don't think so. Strategic these are other elements shaping grand strategy. Geopolitical assets, including its territorial position, the size of the economy, national morale. Again, those are the elements of power capability. I think all of this is the beginning of a repudiation of neorealism. You start talking about strategic culture, you start talking about national morale, you start talking about complexity in a country's foreign policy making process. You stop looking upon foreign policy as basically just determined by your relative power capabilities in relationship to other countries. That we have to look at the foreign policymaking process within Washington, within Beijing. We have to look at the politics of making foreign policy in Beijing, in Moscow, in Washington. That means you have to talk about different interest groups, different political players, different political interests, different perceptions of reality. But neorealism doesn't really focus on that. They say you don't really need to look at all that messy complexity. You just need to compare how big this country's power capability is to this country, and you can predict the relationship. So I've done a lot of talking. I get really excited about this kind of stuff. And I'm log back in. So. The world came close to nuclear war on at least one occasion, probably more during the Cold War. So if somebody had made different choices at different times, we might not be sitting here right now. And so let me ask you this question. So please respond to the following statement. Today, the U.S. should appease Russia and China. So let me open up that exercise I have set up for today. And so that is the term, right? Remember we talked about earlier in the course about how the prevailing view was that the United States successfully contained the Russian version of Nazi Germany. Supposedly, that was what the Soviet Union was. And this is all derived from this terrible experiment, this terrible case of dealing with Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. Why was Hitler's Germany in 1938, 1939, why was it belligerent and obnoxious and nasty? Was it belligerent, obnoxious, and nasty because it thought it was humiliated? That it was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles? That Germany was humiliated by not being treated as an equal, not being allowed to have a navy, not being allowed to have an air force, only being allowed to have an army of 100,000 men, having to pay hundreds of millions of dollars worth of reparations after World War I and say World War I was our fault. After losing all of that territory and after World War I, was Germany under Hitler belligerent and making belligerent demands because it felt humiliated? In other words, it wanted national dignity? It wanted unity of all Germans in one German state so they're not abused by those nasty Czechs and Poles. And they want independence, the right to have their own navy, the right to have an air force, just like any European power, as well as Hitler's own desire to be ruler of Germany. Or was Hitler's Germany belligerent because it saw amazing opportunity? That, look how pathetic those French are. We won't even talk about Belgium. We won't even look what the Soviets are doing to themselves. Stalin's killing all of his soldiers, all of his officers. Oh my God. We have this chance to finally do World War I over and this time win. We have solved our problems. We don't have an economic depression. We don't have 40 governments in 21 years like Paris between 1919 and 1940. We don't need that bourgeois democracy. Personal power that Hitler wants to be the dictator of Europe. National grandeur, dominate and beat up the French just for the sake of beating up the French. And the people loved Hitler. Remember, before the start of the war, if he had bothered with elections, he would have won in a landslide. He made Germans feel good to be German again. And so if you appease this actor, by saying, okay, Germany, you can have the Sudetenland, you can hold on to that. If you appease this actor, if this actor sees you like this, and you give it what it wants, you confirm that you really are a sissy, that you really are just completely unable to do what you need to do. You don't appease an aggressive power. And that lesson dominated two generations of decision makers in the United States during the Cold War until the early 1990s. Appeasement of this is a disaster. You have to contain Hitler's Germany so it doesn't see this. You have to show it that you have the will to resist. You will fight nasty little wars, because if you don't fight a nasty little war in Korea and Vietnam now, you're going to fight World War III later. So back to so people argue about appeasement. Appeasement is a bad word. Appeasement is a bad word. If you appease somebody, everybody thinks about 1939 Europe. Here's an article from 13 years ago highlighting how appeasement made sense in dealing with Germany at the time, because Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister, thought he could work with Germany to protect the British Empire. And that if he gave Germany what they wanted, Germany would cooperate with Britain to protect Britain's interests in Asia and elsewhere. And, but of course, this whole article is mentioned about appeasement being bad. Appeasement made World War II more likely, not less likely. We're trying to prevent war, and appeasement made World War II more likely. Maybe we needed to fight a war against Germany, but 10 million dead is better than 60 million dead. If we'd fought a war in 1937-38 against Germany, it would have been bad, but it wouldn't have been as bad as World War II. And then, of course, the Soviet Union used World War II to conquer half of Europe on the way to Berlin. So this whole discussion of appeasement, it is reflected in this notion of the Cold War, and that the Americans supposedly learned from that experience to contain the Soviet Union. Wherever it attempted to expand in the nuclear setting, indirectly through telling Kim Il-sung, take Seoul, Ho Chi Minh, take Saigon, Fidel Castro, take Havana, Patrice Lumumba, bring the Congo into the communist orbit. That the Americans successfully contained the Soviet Union And so do we appease, since you are here in North Korea, should we appease Pyongyang? The Biden administration should appease Pyongyang, North Korea, and negotiate a formal treaty agreement ending the Korean War. That's what Pyongyang and North Korea want. They want the Korean War, which is still ongoing. There's just a ceasefire since 1953. And Kim Jong-un wants to negotiate a formal peace treaty between Seoul, Pyongyang, Tokyo, Beijing, Russia, a formal peace treaty ending the war, acknowledging that North Korea is a real, legitimate member of the international community. The Americans can do business with it, can trade with it. Should the Americans give North Korea what it wants? Should it appease Pyongyang? So let me divide you into your breakout rooms. And so we go here and chatting. That's chatting. That's chat. I don't want to chat. I want to go into breakout rooms. So this is breakout rooms. And so we go into, let's go 3 groups here, assign automatically. The first person in each group will speak for the group. And that is Dahi in group 1. Anais, is Anais here? Okay. And Alisa for group 3. So please join your groups. And you know what I have to do? I have to close the Zoom session. So Dohi, Nick, and Kim Eugene in group 1, Anais, Timen, and Kim Jaehwan in group 2, and Alisa. All right. Well, I'm just thinking I have to stop the Zoom anyway, because I have to save this file. So I'm going to have to shut it down. And we should have done this earlier, but